G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 8 of Australia's Day of National Shame. Second part of the chapter called The Mistakes. There was one other very curious incident that at the very least implied that the Navy, and in particular its senior intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander James McManus, might even have been as negligent as the RAAF in failing to pass on vital information. If true, then they were almost as responsible as the RAAF for the havoc that was caused by the lack of preparedness. On the northern tip of Melville Island, some 90 kilometres north of Bathurst Island, there was another coast-watching station, manned by a coast-watcher called John Gribble. Like the mission, Gribble had a radio transmitter and had been given a simple code by which he could advise Darwin immediately of any sightings. Unlike the Bathurst Island mission, however, he transmitted his messages not to Darwin radio but direct to the Coonawarra signalling station outside Darwin, which was a naval establishment. Shortly after 9:15, Warrant Officer Bill Foup, who was on duty at the station, telephoned McManus and told him that he had received a message from Gribble reporting, quote, a large number of aircraft, unquote. There were no further details of the number of planes or the direction in which they were flying, but with a raid imminent it should have been treated very seriously. Indeed, McManus did telephone an RAAF intelligence officer who told him of the P-40s and suggested that Gribble's sighting probably referred to them, in spite of the fact that the most cursory glance at a map would have shown that it was unlikely that on a direct course to Koh Peng they would have been within sight of anyone on Melville Island, and that in any case they had been only airborne for about 2 minutes. Whatever the reason, McManus clearly attached no great importance to the report, however wrong that decision was in hindsight. But what is extraordinary is that at the Royal Commission inquiry 3 weeks later, McManus, who was the most voluble of witnesses, never mentioned even the existence of Gribble's report, and was emphatic that the first mention that he had heard that the Japanese might be on the way to Darwin was the signal from ACH when he was with Captain Thomas. Yet, by then, McManus, as the Navy's senior intelligence officer in Darwin, must have established, or could have established, that the aircraft which Gribble saw were indeed Japanese. Meanwhile, back in the RAAF operations room, the discussion was still going on as to whether there were Japanese or American aircraft that were approaching, although one incident reported in the official war history suggests that by 9:46 they had more or less made up their minds. At that time, still 12 minutes before the raid began, the 2nd 14th Field Regiment at Nightcliff, 11 kilometres north of Darwin, telephoned RAAF operations and reported that they had just witnessed a P-40 crashing into the sea and that its pilot was following it down on his parachute. The officer who reported it, Major R.B. Hone, asked if there were any enemy aircraft in the area and was given the reply, quote, if this is a raid, we know nothing of it, unquote. Even though by that time the operations room had been in possession of the signal from the VID for 9 minutes, nobody apparently thought to connect the two incidents. 4 minutes later, Hone was on the telephone again, this time to Army headquarters, to report an aerial dogfight between another P-40 and a Japanese Zero fighter. The Army acknowledged the message but inexplicably did nothing with it. It was never mentioned by any Army witness at the Royal Commission. Although the Japanese were already over the coast by 9:50, if Hone's timing was correct, it was because Fuchida had to fly well inland before he could turn to attack Darwin from the southeast. Nor was Hone the only military man on the telephone to his headquarters at about that time. Not far away, Sergeant William MacDonald was in charge of a machine gun detachment on Casuarina Beach, less than 5 kilometres north of Hone's position. The lookout, a trooper called Cecil Burns, had been watching a large flight of planes coming towards them and suddenly cried out, "The Japs are here." MacDonald made some remark about them probably being friendly and asked Burns how he knew they were Japanese. Quote, because they've got bloody great red spots on them, unquote, Burns shouted back. In an instant, MacDonald was on the telephone to the staff captain at his brigade headquarters and was repeating the information urgently but without getting the response that he wanted. Quote, Mac, I'm busy, said the captain, Howard Brown. Don't play games with me. How do you know they're Japs, unquote. And MacDonald too shouted down the line, because they've got bloody great red spots on them. Brown now telephoned Army headquarters and passed the message on to yet another officer, who once more wanted to know how MacDonald knew they were Japanese. The next moment the problem was resolved for him as the first bombs hit the town. Once again, no mention of this report was made to the Royal Commission. The operations room at RAAF station was not the most conducive place for the orderly processing of signals. There were about 8 telephones, and an officer might be involved in conversations on several of them at the same time. Indeed, Saxton was not even clear when he called out the message from Darwin radio that it had in fact come from there. It occurred to him afterwards that it might have come from the Navy. Quote, "Telephones are not always distinct," he remarked. That in itself might not have been a particularly important confusion, but within 3 minutes, Flight Lieutenant Fenton, the controller, was not even sure whether it had come from ACH, which would mean that there was no need to pass it on to them. Fortunately, that had been resolved by the time he came back to the operations room after advising the station commander, but it does not begin to explain why it took 20 minutes to carry out a simple job of identification that should have taken no more than 3 minutes, or how he could believe the Kitty Hawks were anywhere near Bathurst Island when the mission sent its signal. The first question has never been resolved, but what almost certainly happened was that on the morning when almost every person in Darwin was anticipating a Japanese attack, a warning of a big flight of unidentified aircraft heading towards the town and only 80 kilometres away was ignored, while a group of inexperienced officers chatted amongst themselves about the likelihood of it being a small squadron of American fighters which could not have been anywhere near Bathurst Island in the first place. For in spite of the way Fenton had read his map, it was just impossible, as Saxton quickly realised when he worked it out on the plotting table, for the Kitty Hawks to have been where Fenton put them. If they had been on course and travelling west at 320 kilometres per hour, they could not have been anywhere near Bathurst Island. And even more conclusive was that Fenton knew that they had been recalled after only 10 minutes in the air, and that they had been almost touching down on Darwin Aerodrome as the signal was coming in from the operations room. Further, the station commander, Wing Commander Griffith, could also have worked this out in a matter of moments, and indeed he insisted later that it had never occurred to him that the Japanese aircraft were P-40s, a statement that the other officers on duty declared was a complete reversal of what he actually said at the time. But if Griffith did not think they were P-40s, why did he make no effort to sound the alarm that would have at least warned his own men on the RAAF base? In fact, there seems no doubt from all the available evidence that minutes ticked by without ACH or the RAAF base being warned that the aircraft might be hostile, and that it was not until Griffith heard machine gun fire and looked out of the operations room window almost straight down the sights of a Zero that he ordered the alarm to be sounded. There were other factors that should have warned an RAAF officer with experience, or even common sense, that the approaching aircraft were those of the enemy. There was the report of the P-40 crashing into the sea. It was known that transmissions from Bathurst Island were suddenly being jammed, a favourite technique of the Japanese before an attack. And it was known that the Kitty Hawks had left Darwin on a course of about 280 degrees, and that unless there was an emergency, they would return on the same track as an additional security precaution. If the aircraft reported over Bathurst Island were indeed the Kitty Hawks, it would have meant that they were returning on a completely different course, which itself should have been suspicious on a morning when everything, however seemingly trivial, was important. One of the problems in Darwin was that many aircrews flew in and out without being reported and without any warning. There was poor liaison between the Americans and the Australians, and the aircraft from Brisbane or from the south would suddenly appear out of the blue, or more dangerously for their crews, from across the Timor Sea. The mistake which nearly resulted in the Hudson's being shot down was certainly not the only one that occurred. Clearly there had to be some check on the identity of incoming aircraft, or there would have been an endless succession of extremely disrupting false alarms that would inevitably have the effect of reducing people's preparedness when a genuine raid arrived. But the intention, however wrong it went on the 19th of February, was that this identification would be very rapid, and that if there were any doubts or delays, the alarm would be sounded. It was far better to be safe than sorry, particularly on a day when a raid was almost certain. False alarms also had a very unsettling effect on morale. The previous month there had been a near panic when a force of warships and transports was seen heading towards Darwin. The rumour spread like wildfire that it was a Japanese task force, and it was hours before it was finally realised that the ships were American, not Japanese. Again, when the squadron of P-40s arrived in Darwin, bracket, without any prior notice, close bracket, there was consternation as they suddenly appeared over Darwin. Perhaps all this made those responsible for sounding the alarm act with undue caution, to the point where on the 19th they did nothing at all. The near disaster with the Hudsons would not have helped. Whatever the reason, 22 or 23 minutes passed before RAAF operations came to the conclusion that the aircraft were not friendly, a decision they reached when they saw that the town and their own aerodrome were being bombed. The exact time is not certain, although the warning could not have been given, which could have been given was not less than 22 minutes. It is not certain because on top of all their other failings, the officers in the operations room did not bother to keep a log, one of the most important and basic rules. When the Royal Commission examined the logbook 3 weeks later, there was not a single entry in it between 16th of February and the 20th. The raid might never have happened. The operations log was supposed to contain a detailed record of all events that occurred in the defence area, bracket, the area for which the operations room was responsible, close bracket, throughout the day, as well as the times of arrival and departure of every aircraft, but for those 3 days it was a blank. Saxton said that since his arrival in Darwin only 2 weeks earlier, it was, quote, not usual, unquote, for the officers to use the logbook. He said that at the end of each shift, the officer in charge would record those messages and signals which he could remember or which he thought were unusually important. Apparently on those 3 critical days when 6 Hudsons were almost shot down, when Japanese reconnaissance planes were circling overhead, and a force of 242 enemy planes was razing the town, nothing of consequence was thought to have happened. Certainly Saxton was adamant that nobody had ever told him to record anything in the logbook. Commander Cobbold and other naval and senior RAAF officers were quick to attribute at least some of the blame for the RAAF's failure to the calibre of the junior officers who were on duty. It was a fact that in the previous 3 months there had been 17 changes of officers in the operations room, and in the previous 5 months no less than 30 different officers had worked there. Said Cobbold, quote, it was just a bad system. Little care was shown by personnel in Melbourne to send men suited to that kind of work, and typical of the preparation they had was the training given to one of Saxton's usual colleagues on that shift who was ill with dengue fever on the day of the raid. Pilot Officer Garnett Soliu, an architect with no knowledge of aeroplanes or of flying when he joined the RAAF. He was given 7 weeks training before being commissioned as a pilot officer. In that time he received lectures on Air Force law, Air Force regulations, and for 2 days, 2 hours a day, general military squad drill and a little physical training. When he was commissioned, he was given a further 10 days training, of which 2 were spent on a merchant ship recognition and 2 on signals. After 5 lectures on navigation, he was posted to the Darwin operations room as navigations officer. Lou Kernock, whose anger and bewilderment that his warning had been of no avail to the people of Darwin, had his own theory about why the RAAF were so negligent. Quote, I don't think they took it seriously, he told an old friend. They thought Father McGrath was a bit of an old woman, unquote. If that indeed was a part of the explanation, it could not have been more misplaced. Senior intelligence officers held the priest to be one of the most responsible coast watchers, and that any information he passed should have been treated with the greatest of respect. Certainly on that day he, like Luke Kernock on duty at Darwin Radio, could not have done more. More to come.